The maintenance corridor at Kang Meridian Group was never meant to hold witnesses. At 11:47 p.m., Imani Rhodes received a message on her corporate phone, an official summons, typed in the rigid Korean corporate format she had learned to recognize within her first 6 months at the company. Conference Room B, maintenance level. Urgent matters regarding strategy division. Come alone. The sender field read, Secretary to the Director, by order of CFO Park. She should have questioned it. Any veteran of Seoul's corporate landscape would have. But Imani had spent 4 years climbing this tower, each floor a battle against whispers that her achievements belonged to someone else's connections, someone else's latitude. Questions meant hesitation. Hesitation meant vulnerability. So she rode the elevator down, her heels echoing in the emptiness of the lower floors, her silk blazer wrapped tight against the temperature drop. The maintenance area was a maze of exposed pipes and flickering fluorescent lights. Nobody used this route unless they wanted to avoid the security cameras in the main corridors. She realized that fact only when she saw him, Jae-hyun Lim, the CFO, standing beside a stack of abandoned boxes near the mechanical room door. His light gray suit looked immaculate despite the hour, his cynical expression framed by the shadows cast by the industrial lighting. Ms. Rhodes. He didn't smile. His tone carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Thank you for coming discreetly. Imani's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. This is an unusual venue for a meeting, sir. Unusual times require unusual measures. He stepped closer, his flashy ring catching the light. I wanted to discuss your proposal for the Southeast Asia expansion. The numbers you presented yesterday, they don't align with the financial reality of the division. I verified every metric with the accounting team. Did you? His interruption was surgical. Or did you simply assume that your stellar reputation would carry the numbers through? The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Imani felt her shoulders stiffen. Before she could respond, he continued, his voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. There are people in this building who resent your position, Ms. Rhodes. People who feel that certain advantages have been extended to you that weren't available to others. I'm trying to protect you, which is why I want you to understand something. He moved toward the box stack, gesturing for her to follow. The proposal needs to be reframed, subtly, in a way that distributes credit more evenly. Do you understand what I'm saying? Imani understood perfectly. He was asking her to dilute her own work, to obscure her contributions so that others could claim them. It was a calculated humiliation dressed in the language of mentorship. I'll reconsider the framework, she said carefully, each word a calculated response. But the data is solid regardless of presentation. The data is only as solid as the trust behind it, he replied. Then he turned slightly, as if reaching for something on one of the shelves behind the boxes. And trust in this company is a currency that requires investment. She didn't see his arm move. In that fractional second, her survival instinct screamed at her to step back, but the corridor was narrow, the boxes were arranged deliberately, and her body's response came too late. His hand collided with her shoulder, not quite a push, but forceful enough to send her stumbling backward. Her foot caught the uneven concrete floor. Her body twisted as it fell. The edge of the metal shelf caught her ribs, then her arm struck the box's corner. Then the floor came up to meet her hip. Time became elastic. Pain bloomed in 3 separate locations simultaneously. Her blazer caught on the rough concrete. When she tried to push herself up, her left shoulder screamed. For a moment, lying there in the fluorescent-lit maintenance corridor of the building where she had fought so hard for respect, Imani Rhodes understood something crystalline. She was alone. Utterly, completely alone. Jae-hyun didn't extend his hand. He simply looked down at her with that cynical expression, then adjusted his suit jacket. Perhaps this will help you understand the necessity of collaboration, Ms. Rhodes. Accidents do happen in poorly maintained facilities, especially late at night. He stepped over her with practiced indifference and walked toward the elevator. She lay there for 3 minutes after he left, breathing through the pain, her mind fracturing between the immediate physical reality and the larger catastrophe of what this meant. She couldn't report it. Who would believe her against a CFO's word? And if she tried, she would confirm exactly what everyone whispered about her: that she was unstable, that her success came with an asterisk, that she wasn't really equipped for this level of responsibility. So she did what trauma teaches us to do. She gathered the pieces of herself that were still functional and hid the broken parts. By 6 a.m., she was in the bathroom of her apartment, standing in the shower with water as hot as her skin could tolerate, watching the bruises bloom like watercolor paintings across her shoulder, her ribs, her hip. By 7:30 a.m., she was in front of her mirror, selecting a blazer so perfectly cut that it covered everything except the specific angle needed for professional photographs. By 8:15 a.m., she was riding the elevator back up the tower, her makeup applied with precision, her spine straight, her voice steady. The executive conference room on the 38th floor was all panoramic windows and polished oak. 10 executives sat around the table, each one calculating angles, each one reading the room for advantage. Seung-Jun Kang sat at the head of the table, his black hair and serious expression framed by the morning light flooding in from behind him. At 34, he held the kind of power that was born partly from inheritance, partly from genuine intelligence, and entirely from his willingness to make decisions that others merely contemplated. His minimalist watch caught the light as he gestured for the meeting to begin. Imani had prepared her presentation on Southeast Asia expansion for 3 weeks. The numbers were solid. Not good, exceptional. The market analysis was comprehensive. The risk assessment was realistic. She had built this proposal brick by brick, knowing that every component would be scrutinized, knowing that women of color in Seoul's corporate landscape had to present not just excellence, but perfection. She stood as she always did, shoulders back, blazer immaculate, and began her presentation with the careful modulation that came from years of learning exactly how much confidence sounded authoritative versus arrogant, depending on who was listening. For the first 15 minutes, nobody interrupted. The numbers flowed, the analysis resonated. She was good at this, genuinely talented at reading markets, identifying opportunities, building strategy that worked. This was the part of her job that didn't require armor. Then Jae-hyun asked a question, something technical about currency hedging, and she answered it with the ease of someone who had already considered that variable. She reached for her coffee cup for the briefest moment of reprieve. That's when Seung-Jun stood up. He didn't say anything at first. He simply walked toward her, his expression shifting from the neutral corporate mask he wore to something darker, something that contained controlled fury. The room became still. Even Jae-hyun stiffened fractionally, as if suddenly uncertain of his own position. Seung-Jun stopped less than 2 meters from where Imani stood. His eyes weren't on her face. They were fixed on the line where her blazer had shifted slightly, where for just a moment the neckline had exposed the edge of a purple bruise spreading across her collarbone. The room held its breath. "End the meeting," Seung-Jun said, his voice level but carrying the weight of absolute authority. Nobody moved immediately. "Everyone out. Now." Executives began gathering their materials, with the shuffling urgency of people who understood that resistance would be career suicide. Within 90 seconds, only Imani and Seung-Jun remained in the glass-walled conference room, 38 stories above Seoul, with the entire city sprawled beneath them in morning light. "Don't." Imani's voice was steady, but it cost her everything. "Don't make this a thing." "That bruise," Seung-Jun said quietly, "has been covered by makeup so meticulously that nobody but someone looking for it would notice. The way you held your left arm during the presentation, you're favoring your right side because something hurts. Your breathing pattern changed 3 times during the meeting, shallow inhales, as if your ribs are tender. You arrived at the office at 5:47 a.m., 12 minutes earlier than your usual time, because you needed extra minutes to prepare for this moment." Imani's throat constricted. She had believed her preparation was invisible. "I'm fine," she said, because that's what she had been trained to say. That's what kept her employed, respected, safe. "No." Seung-jun replied, and something in his voice had transformed. The corporate executive was still present, but underneath him was something else. A man watching someone he respected treat her own pain as an inconvenience to be managed. "You're not." He moved toward the glass walls and pressed a button on his watch, speaking into the device with rapid precision in Korean. Then he turned back to her. "My office. Now." It wasn't a request. The private elevator in his office was all minimalist black and subtle lighting. Seung-jun didn't speak during the ride-up. When the doors opened to his executive suite, a space of almost zen-like simplicity, all dark wood and controlled lines, he directed her to the private bathroom. "Remove the blazer." "Sir, I'm not asking." His tone held no anger, only a kind of clinical determination. "I need to see the full extent of the injury." Imani's hands trembled as she removed the blazer. Beneath, her cream-colored silk blouse was loose enough to hide the damage, but when she lifted it slightly, the full geography of the bruising became visible. The deep purple along her ribs where the shelf edge had caught her, the dark bloom across her shoulder, the lesser marks on her hip. It was the physical map of someone's violent intent, documented in her own body. Seung-jun's jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice carried something she had never heard before. Not the polished tone of the CEO, not the filtered professionalism of the executive. This was the sound of someone's fury converting to purpose. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened." She did. The words came in pieces at first, then in a flood. The message, the maintenance corridor, the CFO's presence, the discussion of her proposal that had nothing to do with her proposal. His hand. The boxes arranged in that specific way. The understanding in his eyes when she looked up at him from the floor. Seung-jun listened without interrupting. When she finished, he walked to his desk and opened a drawer, removing a recording device of some kind. Something small and technical. He turned to the woman who had entered his office a moment before. Ji Soo-yoon, his personal secretary, who moved with the quiet competence of someone who had learned to anticipate every need. "I need you to access the maintenance corridor cameras from last night. All angles, all timestamps. And I need you to do it quietly, using only the hardware that doesn't route through standard IT channels. Can you do that?" Jisoo nodded, though her usually calm expression had fractured with concern. She was a woman in her late 20s who had worked for Seung-jun for 3 years, and understood implicitly that his intensity right now signaled something beyond typical corporate crisis. "Yes, sir. How far back?" 24 hours, and arrange for medical evaluation for Ms. Rhodes, someone who can document injuries, someone I trust. After Jisoo left, Seung-jun turned back to Imani. "Here, there is no room for violence disguised as ambition. Starting today, everything changes." She wanted to ask what that meant, how he could possibly change the fundamental structure of a corporation, how retaliation could do anything except compound the disaster. But something in his expression stopped the questions. Instead, she heard herself ask, "What happens now?" "Now," Seung-jun said, walking to his window overlooking Seoul. "We dismantle the machinery that allowed this." The next morning, Imani Rhodes received an email at 6:33 a.m., timestamp embedded in the corporate system like a digital fingerprint. It came from an account that shouldn't exist, a forwarded batch of messages from a chain that had been deliberately erased from the normal servers. The subject line read, "Evidence. Do not forward." She opened it with her hands shaking slightly, despite the fact that she was now fully aware of what was happening. The emails dated back 8 months. They were exchanges between Jae-hyun Lim and someone she didn't immediately recognize, an external consultant with a company registered in a building she later learned was connected to the Kang family rivals. The language was coded at first. Managing the competition, strategic pressure, ensuring market positioning. But as the months progressed, the language became specific. Plans to sabotage the Southeast Asia proposal. Strategies to undermine Imani's credibility by inserting false data into her reports and then publicly correcting her. A campaign to isolate her from the executive team by spreading rumors about her methodology and work ethic. At the bottom of the email chain, there was an attachment, a bank transfer receipt, 2,000,001, marked as consultant fees. Imani sat in her apartment, coffee cooling beside her laptop, and felt the peculiar sensation of violation that comes with discovering the architecture of someone's hatred directed at you. He hadn't disliked her work. He had orchestrated her destruction systematically, methodically, with the patience of someone who understood that the best sabotage looked like incompetence. She forwarded the email to Seung-jun with a single line. "I don't know how you got this, but it's real." His response came within 90 seconds. The company needs to see this in the right context, not as internal warfare, but as a breach of fiduciary responsibility. "I'm calling a board meeting for this afternoon. Can you be here by 2 p.m.? By 1:15 p.m., Imani was in the strategy division office, sitting at her desk with her blazer buttoned tight and her makeup applied with the precision of someone preparing for war. Her colleagues moved around her with the careful distance of people who sensed something seismic had shifted, but couldn't yet identify what. Min-hee Park, the HR director, stopped by her desk around 1:45 p.m. She was a woman in her mid-40s who had spent 20 years navigating the politics of the company, and her face now carried the expression of someone who understood that her complicity, her knowledge of internal schemes, her silence, was about to be weaponized against her. "Ms. Rhodes," she said carefully, "I hope you understand that I never intended any harm toward you personally. I simply stayed silent, which I now understand was its own kind of harm." Imani looked up at this woman, who had smiled at her in hallways while colleagues whispered, who had maintained professional distance while knowing exactly what was happening behind closed doors. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because," Min-hee said, "I received a call from Mr. Kang's office asking me to provide documentation of every conversation I had with the CFO regarding the strategy division. Conversations I had hoped would remain private, and I realized that staying silent had simply extended the timeline of injustice. I should have spoken 3 months ago. I should have spoken 6 months ago. But I'm speaking now. I hope that's enough." She left a folder on Imani's desk and walked away with the defeated posture of someone who had made a choice and understood the cost. The folder contained 4 months of HR incident reports, complaints from other employees, documentation of questionable bonus distributions, email trails that showed inconsistent application of company policy. The pattern was undeniable. Jae-hyun had systematically used his position to consolidate power by eliminating threats and elevating allies. At 2 p.m., Imani entered the boardroom on the 42nd floor. The entire C-suite was present. The CFO sitting with calculated confidence, the COO looking uncertain, the CTO confused about her sudden inclusion in board-level decisions. The external directors were there too. 3 individuals brought in from other companies to serve as oversight. And at the head of the table, Seung-jun Kang sat with the kind of controlled tension that suggested he had already rehearsed this moment multiple times in his mind. "Thank you all for making time on short notice," he began, his tone formal and clipped. "I have called this meeting to address a serious matter that affects not just our corporate structure, but our fundamental integrity as an organization. I am going to present evidence of systematic misconduct on the part of our Chief Financial Officer, Jae-hyun Lim. I will present this evidence in 3 stages: financial impropriety, external sabotage, and internal harassment. After I have presented the evidence, Mr. Lim will have the opportunity to respond. But I want to be clear. Regardless of his response, the consequences of these actions are already determined. By the end of this meeting, his employment with Kang Meridian Group will be terminated, and I am filing formal complaints with both corporate regulators and the police." The room shifted. The CFO's face remained composed, but Imani could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Assessing angles, preparing narratives. For the next 40 minutes, Seung-jun presented the evidence methodically. The bank transfers, the email chains, the sabotage of the Southeast Asia proposal, the deliberate insertion of false data into financial reports. the external connections to rival companies, the systematic isolation of high-performing employees. Each piece of evidence was presented without emotional commentary, just facts arranged in sequence until they formed an inescapable picture. When Seung-jun showed the board a time-stamped security video of the maintenance corridor incident, Jae-hyun's hand colliding with Imani, her fall, his departure, the external director's expressions changed from skeptical to horrified. "This is assault," one of them said quietly. "This is also evidence of a calculated attack on an employee who had become a threat to his position," Seung-jun replied. "And it suggests a pattern of behavior that extends beyond simple corporate politics into genuine criminality." Jae-hyun finally spoke, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed his position was still negotiable. "This is a fabrication designed to protect an employee who has been underperforming. Mr. Kang has always had a soft spot for certain individuals. This entire narrative is constructed to—" "Stop," Seung-jun interrupted. "Your words are being recorded. Everything you say from this moment forward is documented. Your legal team will advise you that continuing to make accusations is only solidifying the case against you. So I suggest you speak to your lawyer before you speak to anyone else in this company." He then turned to the external directors. "I am also requesting an independent audit of all decisions made by the CFO's office in the last 2 years. And I am implementing an immediate policy. Every executive decision affecting personnel, budget allocation, or strategic direction will now require sign-off from both the CFO role and the head of strategy, with all communications recorded and archived. We are eliminating the single points of control that allowed this to happen." Then, in a moment that would be discussed in corporate hallways for months afterward, he stood and addressed the entire room. "I have become aware that I have been complicit in allowing a culture where ambition was valued above ethics, where results could justify any means, where loyalty to individuals took precedence over loyalty to truth. That culture ends today. Every member of this leadership team will be subject to behavioral assessment. Every decision will be questioned. And every employee who has been harmed by our previous negligence will receive formal acknowledgement and restitution." He looked directly at Imani, and something passed between them. An understanding that this moment was as much about his own reckoning as it was about external justice. "We are adjourning," he concluded. "Security will escort Mr. Lim from the premises. HR will coordinate his departure and ensure proper legal protocols are followed. This meeting is concluded." The medical evaluation confirmed what Imani's body already knew. The fall had caused bruising to soft tissue, mild contusions to her ribs, and a moderate shoulder strain. Nothing broken, nothing permanent, just pain that would fade within 2 weeks, leaving behind only the internal knowledge of what had happened. But the corporate aftermath moved slower than bodily healing. By evening, the story was already fragmenting into different narratives depending on which media outlet was reporting it. One news agency ran with, "Internal power struggle at Kang Meridian leads to CFO dismissal." Another focused on CEO implements new accountability measures in corporate restructuring. A third publication, the one that made Seung-jun's jaw clench when he read it, ran with, "Has workplace harassment scandal become the new corporate norm?" That last headline, with its implication that the scandal was normal rather than systemic, was what finally broke his carefully maintained equilibrium. Imani was in the company medical clinic on the 35th floor, a small facility maintained for executive injuries and routine health care, when Seung-jun entered without knocking. The physician, Dr. Choi, was applying a therapeutic wrap around Imani's ribs. "I'll give you privacy," Dr. Choi said, reading the room with professional discretion. When they were alone, Seung-jun pulled up something on his phone and turned it toward Imani. It was the headline, with its casual implication that sexual harassment was simply another item in the inventory of corporate normalcy. "This is the story we're fighting against," he said, his voice carrying frustration that felt personal. "Not the individual act, that's being handled, but the narrative that suggests this is somehow acceptable because it's common. That bothers me. Specifically, it bothers me because I know that for people like you, people like—" He stopped, recognizing that he was moving into territory that required careful articulation. People who are already navigating additional scrutiny. This headline dismisses your injury as simply part of the landscape. That's not acceptable to me. Imani held the medical wrap in place and looked at this man who had, in the space of 24 hours, transformed from her superior into something more complicated. An ally, a protector, someone whose commitment to justice seemed to be extending into personal dimensions she wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to do an interview," he replied. "Not with the journalists who are trying to sensationalize this, but with someone who understands the systemic issues. I'm going to speak on record about what we found, and I'm going to position this not as an isolated incident, but as a symptom of a larger organizational dysfunction. That could damage the company's reputation further," Imani said carefully. "Yes, but remaining silent about it damages the company's actual structure. I've been thinking about this since childhood, actually. Watching my father run a different division of the family business. Watching him make decisions based on connections and reputation rather than merit. And I built this company with the explicit intention of doing things differently. But I don't think I actually walk the walk. I think I made it easier for people like Jae-hyun to operate, because I was so focused on the numbers that I was willing to overlook the machinery." He looked away, toward the window. From the 35th floor, you could see the Han River cutting through Seoul like a promise of something cleaner than what the city contained. "The person I want to interview with," he continued, "is someone you know. A journalist named Elena Rose. She's been covering corporate governance issues in South Korea for about 5 years. She has credibility, she has reach, and she doesn't sensationalize. I want to give her the full story. But I want to do it with your permission, because you're the central figure in this, and if you're not comfortable with that level of public discussion, I won't do it." Imani was quiet for a moment. The medical wrap held her ribs in place, supporting her while her body healed. It was such a simple thing. This external structure that allowed her to move without pain. And yet it felt profound in the moment. The idea that sometimes holding together required assistance, that strength and support weren't contradictory. "Do it," she said. "But I want to read it before it's published. And I want some say in how my experience is framed." "Agreed," Seung-joon replied immediately. The interview took place in a private conference room at a hotel neutral enough to be beyond corporate territory. Elena Rose was a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and sharper intelligence, someone who had built a reputation for extracting complexity from what seemed like simple stories. She came with a cameraman and a portable recorder, and she set up her equipment with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Seung-joon sat across from her with Imani present in the room, though not visible to the camera. He wanted her to be able to interrupt if his framing diverged from her reality, though he suspected it wouldn't. "So, Mr. Kang," Elena began, "your company employs approximately 8,500 people across 12 countries. Your revenue was approximately 4.2 trillion won last year. You maintain a reputation as one of the more progressive corporate environments in Seoul. And then, yesterday, you terminated your chief financial officer for what you're describing as systematic abuse of power. Walk me through how this happened." For the next 45 minutes, Seung-joon laid out the facts. Not from the perspective of vindication, but from the perspective of acknowledged failure. He explained that he had built the company with the intent of operating differently from traditional chaebols, but that he had failed to implement sufficient oversight mechanisms. He had valued results above process, which had created space for people like Jae-hyun to operate without sufficient check on their behavior. "I was willing to tolerate what I thought were minor ethical compromises," he said at one point, "because I was focused on building something bigger. I now understand that there are no minor ethical compromises. They're simply compromises that haven't been exposed yet." Elena asked about the assault specifically, and Seung-joon described it in clinical terms. The location, the circumstances, the decision to report it rather than contain it. He explained that he had considered keeping the matter internal, using corporate discipline rather than law enforcement. "I spoke to my legal team about that option," he said. And I realized that by containing it, I would be communicating to every other person in my company that violence against employees is acceptable as long as nobody outside the company finds out. I couldn't do that. I couldn't live with that. Then Elena asked a question that changed the texture of the conversation. Do you believe this incident reflects something unique to your company, or do you think it reflects something systemic in Korean corporate culture? Seung-jun paused. In that pause, Imani could see him wrestling with how to answer, how to be honest without destroying his company, how to acknowledge systemic problems without seeming to excuse individual responsibility. I think it reflects something systemic, he finally said. I think in an environment where success is valued above almost everything else, where there's enormous pressure on employees to deliver results, where hierarchy and loyalty are still deeply embedded in how we structure authority, in that environment, there are going to be people who exploit those systems. That's not unique to my company. It's probably happening in hundreds of Korean companies right now. The question isn't whether it's happening. The question is whether leaders are willing to expose it when it does. After the interview concluded, and Elena and her cameraman had packed their equipment, Seung-jun sat alone with Imani in the empty conference room. That was harder than I expected, he admitted. You did well, Imani said. You didn't try to make it about you, even though you could have positioned it that way, the visionary leader who cleanses his company. That's not the story, he replied. The story is about a woman who was hurt by someone in a position of power, and about what we do when that happens. The story is also about whether we're willing to change the systems that made that injury possible. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at Seoul's evening skyline, all neon and glass, and the kind of beauty that comes from ambition, crystallized into architecture. I want to ask you something personal, he said, not turning to face her. And I want you to answer honestly, not with the professional filter you usually maintain. Why did you stay in the maintenance corridor after you were injured? Why didn't you immediately go to security or a hospital? Imani felt the question settle into her chest like weight. Nobody had asked her that, not the medical team, not the investigators, because the answer was too complicated to articulate quickly. Because I was afraid, she said quietly. Afraid that if I made a noise about it, I would become defined by the injury rather than by what I contribute to the company. Afraid that reporting it would be interpreted as a sign of weakness. Afraid that even if he faced consequences, it wouldn't change the fact that he had wanted to hurt me, and I didn't know what that meant about my place in the organization. Seung-jun turned to face her then. That fear isn't unique to you, and it's not a sign of weakness. It's a rational response to a system that has failed to protect people. I think that's what the interview is actually about. Not my vindication, but the creation of space for that fear to be named, because once it's named, it can be addressed. The interview was published on a Friday. By Monday morning, it had been shared more than 2 million times across social media platforms, and corporate Korea was having a conversation it hadn't planned to have. Supportive voices emerged. Other executives who had experienced or witnessed similar dynamics. Employees who felt vindicated by the public acknowledgement that the systems were broken. But opposition emerged too. Traditionalists who saw the interview as an attack on Korean corporate culture. Competitors who seized the opportunity to position their own companies as more trustworthy. Media figures who questioned whether one incident warranted such systemic criticism. The most significant response came from an unexpected source. Park Hae-kyung, the matriarch of a rival chaebol family. She held a press conference in which she criticized Seung-jun for undermining the foundations of Korean business culture and prioritizing individual grievances over corporate cohesion. The language was coded but clear. He had betrayed the implicit agreements that held the elite corporate world together. That statement, delivered with all the weight of her 70 years and her family's considerable power, was when Imani realized that the professional consequences of what had happened might actually exceed the personal ones. She was in the strategy division office when the CEO called her up to his suite. "Did you see Park's statement?" he asked without preamble. "Yes." "She's going to move against us," he said. "Not directly. That's not how these power plays work." But she'll encourage her political connections to slow some of our regulatory approvals. She'll lean on business partners to reconsider contracts. She'll use her media connections to continue the narrative that I'm destabilizing Korean business culture. It's not going to be dramatic. It's going to be like trying to do business with a persistent headache. Are you regretting the interview? Imani asked carefully. No, he replied immediately. But I'm being realistic about the cost. Which is why I'm going to accelerate some of our plans. I'm announcing a new division, corporate accountability. You're going to lead it. Imani felt the offer settle into her, like something both terrifying and necessary. That's a significant promotion for someone who was just assaulted by the previous CFO. Which is exactly why you're the right person for it, he replied. Because you understand viscerally why these systems matter. And because you're not going to make the same mistakes I made, valuing results above ethics. He pulled up something on his computer and turned the screen toward her. It was a preliminary organizational chart for the new division. Positions, responsibilities, reporting structures. There was something elegant about its design. Decentralized decision-making, multiple points of oversight, explicit protections for whistleblowers. This is going to attract attention, she said. Not just from competitors, but from our own employees. Some of them are going to feel like they're being investigated constantly. Let them, Seung-jun replied. Better constant low-level discomfort than periodic catastrophes. And the people worth keeping, the ones who actually want to work in an ethical environment, they're going to be relieved. For 3 weeks after the CFO's termination, Imani arrived at the office at 5:30 a.m. The building was quiet at that hour. Only the overnight security team and the cleaners, the spaces between all the performance and politics. She would go to the cafeteria on the ground floor and prepare 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one left on Seung-jun's desk before he arrived. She never left a note. It was simply the ritual of silent care, the kind of gesture that couldn't be misinterpreted as anything except what it was. Acknowledgement that someone else also cared about moving through these early morning hours when the building felt like it belonged to fewer people. Seung-jun never commented on the coffee, but he always found it. And by the 2nd week, she noticed that he had started arriving earlier too, so that sometimes they would encounter each other in his office. Not quite alone, but solitary enough that conversation felt possible. On the morning of what would become the turning point, they were both there when Ji-soo-yoon entered with a folder containing something that would shift the entire narrative again. I found something you need to see, Ji-soo said, her usually calm voice carrying an undertone of urgency. It wasn't in the initial investigation because it was stored in a separate system that I only recently had access to. But it's recordings, conversations between the CFO and someone in city government. Someone in the city government who was advocating for policy positions that would benefit Kang Meridian's competitors. Seung-jun opened the folder and reviewed the documents, his expression growing darker as he read. This is corruption. This is not just internal corporate misconduct. This is actively working against his employer for external benefit. And it's criminal, Ji-soo added quietly. I mean, it was already criminal what he did to Ms. Rhodes. But this is also breaches of fiduciary duty, possibly fraud. After Ji-soo left, Seung-jun sat in silence for a moment, holding the folder like it contained something radioactive. This is going to require police involvement, he said. We've already filed the initial complaint about the assault, but this opens up a larger investigation. How do you feel about that? Imani asked, understanding that the question was asking for more than the surface response. Complicated, he admitted. Part of me wants to bury this. Part of me believes that if we expose it, it's only going to be worse for the company. The media will take this as vindication of every criticism they've made about corporate corruption in Korea. Our stock price will probably drop. Some business partners might distance themselves. But, Imani prompted, understanding that there was more. But if I don't expose it, I'm complicit again. And I promised myself I wouldn't be. After seeing what happened to you, after understanding the cost of my silence, I can't go back to that. He stood and walked to the window. The dawn was just beginning to pink the sky, the city transitioning from the darkness of the night shift into the brighter performance of morning. I'm going to call our legal team and have them coordinate with the police directly, and I'm going to make a public statement tonight. That night, Seung-jun held a second press conference. His statement was briefer than the first, and more direct. He explained that in reviewing the circumstances surrounding the CFO's termination, he had discovered evidence of additional criminal activity. He was turning over all evidence to law enforcement. He was not requesting special treatment, and he was not attempting to influence the investigation in any way. What followed was a pause, and then, before the journalists could formulate their questions, he added, "I want to be very clear about something. This company failed, not just the CFO. The company failed to create systems robust enough to prevent this behavior. I failed as a leader to implement sufficient oversight, and I failed as a human being to act when I should have acted. Going forward, that failure is going to be the organizing principle of how we rebuild this institution. We will be designing every system, every policy, every decision with the intention of preventing abuse. And we will accept the costs of that commitment, whatever they turn out to be." Takagore. Chapter 6. Glass Curtain. The investigation took 6 weeks. During that time, the company entered a strange liminal space where normal operations continued but felt hollow, as if everyone was performing their jobs while the real work happened in other rooms, other conversations. The media split into increasingly polarized camps. Some outlets portrayed Seung-jun as a crusading CEO, using his platform to drive actual reform. Others portrayed him as a manipulator, using the incident to consolidate power and eliminate a rival. A few outlets suggested that both things might be simultaneously true. Imani spent those 6 weeks designing the corporate accountability division, which meant she was essentially designing the machinery that would prevent her own harm from being possible in the future. There was something both empowering and tragic about that work, the understanding that she had to think about how to protect employees from the exact vulnerability she had experienced. She interviewed dozens of employees, people at every level of the organization. What emerged was a pattern she hadn't anticipated. Most people who had experienced unfair treatment had never reported it, not because they lacked evidence, but because they lacked faith that reporting would change anything. One engineer, a woman in her 30s, said, "I had my ideas stolen multiple times by the senior director. I documented it. I considered reporting it. But I knew that reporting it would require me to make a case against someone more powerful than me. And I knew the outcome was already determined. So I stopped generating ideas that were worth stealing. I made myself smaller so I could survive." That conversation haunted Imani for days afterward. The engineer had essentially performed professional self-mutilation to avoid being exploited, and she had done it with the rational calculation of someone who understood the system perfectly. Another employee, a junior analyst in finance, described watching his manager take credit for a risk assessment model he had built over 6 months. "I learned that loyalty in this company meant accepting that your contributions would be attributed to whoever had more social capital. And I decided that if I wanted to advance, I needed to become the person who took credit, rather than the person who generated it." These interviews accumulated into a document that was both devastating and necessary. A catalog of institutional failures, each one representing a moment when someone had decided that survival required compromising their own integrity. Imani compiled the findings into a presentation that she delivered to the executive leadership team on a Thursday afternoon. The conference room was the same one where she had given the Southeast Asia presentation, the one where Seung-jun had first noticed her bruises. There was a kind of symmetry to returning here with evidence of how deep the dysfunction ran. "What I've discovered," she began, "is that the CFO's behavior wasn't an anomaly. It was the most visible manifestation of a culture that we built collectively. A culture where power was concentrated, where questioning authority was discouraged, where advancement required learning to navigate politics rather than excelling at work. The assault was horrific, and it was also predictable given the systems we had in place." She walked them through the data, dozens of incidents, patterns of behavior, structural vulnerabilities. The COO looked increasingly uncomfortable. The CTO kept taking notes. Seung-jun sat with the expression of someone absorbing information that confirmed his worst suspicions. The recommendations, Imani continued, are structural. We need to decentralize decision-making authority. We need to implement transparent promotion criteria. We need to create reporting mechanisms that don't require employees to confront their abusers directly. We need to conduct regular climate assessments. And we need to be prepared for the fact that some of our best performers, people who have succeeded under the old system, are going to resist these changes because their success depended on exploiting the vulnerabilities we're trying to eliminate. After the presentation, several executives left quickly, but Seung-jun remained. He walked to the window, the glass curtain that separated the conference room from the city below, and looked out at Seoul in the afternoon light. "This is going to be more expensive than I anticipated," he said quietly. "Not financially. I expected financial costs, but culturally. We're going to lose people who were good at their jobs, but whose success came from gaming the system. And we're going to have to accept that some of our past achievements were built on the exploitation you just documented." "Yes," Imani agreed. "But the alternative is continuing to build on that foundation, which means we'd be guaranteeing that someone else will experience what I experienced. Maybe worse." He turned to face her. "I want to show you something." He pulled up a file on his tablet and handed it to her. It was a financial analysis, a projection of what implementing all of her recommendations would cost over the next 3 years. The number was substantial, approximately 800 million won in direct costs, plus the indirect costs of slower decision-making, more oversight, reduced efficiency in the short term. "I'm approving all of it," he said. "And I'm going to announce it publicly, along with the findings from your investigation. Not the individual incidents. Those stay confidential unless the people involved want to share them. But the patterns, the structural failures. I want the market to understand what we're doing and why. That's going to affect the stock price," Imani said. "Probably," he agreed. "But I've been thinking about something you said during one of our early morning conversations. You said that the company's value shouldn't be measured just in profit but in the lives it makes possible. I dismissed it at the time as idealistic. But I think you were right. If our profit comes from exploiting people, then the profit is meaningless. It's just numbers extracted from suffering." The footage from the maintenance corridor became central evidence in the criminal investigation. What the security team discovered, however, was more extensive than anyone had anticipated. The CFO had made multiple trips to that corridor over the previous 6 months, always late at night, always meeting with people who weren't employees. Ji Soo-yoon had been the one to compile the footage, working with the security director to piece together a timeline. She presented her findings to Seung-jun and Imani in a private meeting, her usual composure cracking slightly as she explained what she had found. He was using that corridor as a meeting point because it had a blind spot in the camera coverage, she explained. Someone had deliberately angled the camera wrong about 8 months ago during routine maintenance. It created a space of about 3 meters where people could stand without being recorded. But the cameras still captured people entering and leaving the corridor, which is how I was able to identify the pattern. She pulled up a series of images, different people, different dates, but all following the same route, entering through the service elevator, standing in the blind spot for 10 to 30 minutes, then leaving through the parking garage. "I ran facial recognition on the individuals," Jisoo continued. 3 of them work for competing companies. 2 are journalists who have written critical pieces about Kang Meridian. 1 is a city council member who has been blocking some of our infrastructure permits. And 1, she paused, her expression tightening. 1 is the son of Park Hae-kyung, the matriarch who gave that press conference criticizing Mr. Kang. The revelation settled into the room like frost. Seung-jun leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. So the CFO wasn't just sabotaging the company internally. He was actively coordinating with our competitors and our political opponents. "It appears so," Jisoo confirmed. "And based on the timing of these meetings, several of them occurred just before major business setbacks we experienced. The failed regulatory approval for the Incheon facility happened 2 days after he met with the city council member. The negative media coverage about our labor practices appeared 3 days after he met with one of the journalists. Imani felt something cold settle in her chest. He orchestrated all of it. The assault wasn't random violence. It was part of a larger strategy to destabilize the company from within. I think that's correct, Jisoo said. And I think Ms. Rhodes was targeted specifically because she was one of the few executives who couldn't be bought or intimidated through normal channels. You were succeeding on merit, which made you dangerous to his plans. After Jisoo left, Seung-joon sat in silence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something beyond anger, a kind of cold determination that Imani hadn't heard before. This changes the nature of what we're dealing with, he said. This isn't just internal corruption. This is corporate espionage. And it means that some of our biggest setbacks over the past year weren't accidents or market forces. They were deliberate sabotage coordinated by someone we trusted with our financial future. What are you going to do? Imani asked. I'm going to take this evidence to the prosecutors handling the criminal case, he replied. And then I'm going to have a very direct conversation with Park Hae-kyung. Because if her son is involved in corporate espionage, she needs to understand that her public criticism of me is going to look very different in light of her family's actual behavior. That's risky, Imani said carefully. Going after a Chaebol family directly, that could trigger retaliation that makes the CFO's sabotage look minor. I know, Seung-joon said. But the alternative is accepting that powerful families can attack us with impunity as long as they do it through proxies. And I can't accept that. Not anymore. The confrontation with Park Hae-kyung happened in a private dining room at one of Seoul's most exclusive restaurants. The kind of place where business is conducted over 12-course meals, and every detail of the environment is designed to remind you of the stakes. Seung-joon went alone, against the advice of his legal team. He wore his most formal suit, carried only his phone and a single folder of documents, and arrived exactly on time, not early, which would suggest anxiety, and not late, which would suggest disrespect. Park Hae-kyung was already seated when he arrived. She was a woman in her late 60s, with the kind of presence that came from decades of wielding power. Her white hair styled with precision, her modern hanbok in deep blue, a statement of both tradition and contemporary authority. Mr. Kang, she said, her tone formal but not cold. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Thank you for extending it, he replied, taking his seat across from her. For the first 20 minutes, they discussed neutral topics: economic conditions, regulatory changes, mutual acquaintances in the business community. It was the dance of corporate etiquette, each person demonstrating their sophistication and patience. Then Park Hae-kyung shifted the conversation. I wanted to speak with you because I believe your recent actions have been misguided. The public criticism of Korean corporate culture, the exposure of internal conflicts. These decisions reflect poorly, not just on your company, but on all of us who operate in this environment. Seung-joon set down his teacup with careful precision. I appreciate your concern. However, I believe that maintaining the appearance of propriety while allowing actual corruption to flourish is more damaging to Korean business than exposing and correcting it. Exposure has costs, she replied. Costs to reputation, to market stability, to the confidence that international partners have in our business environment. Corruption also has costs, he countered. Costs measured in the lives of employees who are harmed, in the erosion of trust within organizations, in the long-term sustainability of businesses built on exploitation. She smiled slightly, though it didn't reach her eyes. You speak like an idealist, Mr. Kang. That's admirable in its way. But idealism doesn't account for the complex realities of how business actually operates. That's when Seung-joon opened the folder he had brought. He removed a single photograph, a security image of her son entering the maintenance corridor of Kang Meridian headquarters, timestamp clearly visible, and placed it on the table between them. This is your son, he said quietly. Entering my building to meet with my CFO on 11 separate occasions over the past 6 months. During those meetings, confidential information was exchanged. Strategic plans were disclosed. Sabotage was coordinated. And on the night my head of strategy was assaulted, your son was in the building, though not in the corridor where the assault occurred. Park Hae-kyung's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation about how to respond. My son's business activities are his own, she said carefully. His activities include corporate espionage, Seung-jun replied. And before you suggest that I lack evidence, I should tell you that I have extensive documentation, security footage, financial records, communications between your son and my former CFO. All of it has been turned over to prosecutors, so when you lecture me about damaging Korean business culture, I want you to understand that your family has been actively engaged in illegal conduct, designed to damage my company. The silence that followed was weighted with threat and counter-threat, calculation and recalculation. What do you want? Park Hae-kyung finally asked, her voice stripped of pretense. I want you to stop the political pressure against my company, Seung-jun said. I want you to instruct your media contacts to stop running coordinated criticism. And I want your son to cooperate fully with the investigation. In exchange, I will not pursue civil action against your family for the damages caused by his involvement. I will not make his role public beyond what's necessary for the criminal case. And I will not use this situation to attack your family's reputation. You're asking me to surrender significant leverage, she observed. I'm asking you to accept responsibility, he corrected. Your son broke the law. Your family's political influence was used to harm my company. I'm offering you a way to resolve this that doesn't become a public spectacle. But if you refuse, I will pursue every available legal remedy. And I will be transparent about your family's role in what happened. The choice is yours. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the photograph of her son. When she spoke again, her voice carried something almost like respect. You've changed since you started this company, Mr. Kang. You used to be more flexible. I learned that flexibility in the service of avoiding conflict eventually becomes complicity, he replied. I'm no longer interested in being complicit. She folded her hands on the table. I will speak to my son, and I will adjust the political pressure. But understand that this conversation represents a permanent shift in our relationship. You will not be able to call on my family's support in the future. I understand, Seung-jun said, and I accept that cost. The speech happened on a Tuesday morning in the main auditorium of Kang Meridian headquarters, a space that could hold approximately 500 people, filled now with employees from every division, every level of the organization. Seung-jun stood at the podium with Imani seated in the front row. He had spent 3 days writing the speech, revising it, questioning whether he was striking the right balance between accountability and hope. Over the past 2 months, he began, his voice carrying through the sound system with clarity. This company has experienced a crisis. Not a market crisis, not a financial crisis, but a crisis of integrity. We discovered that someone we trusted with significant authority had systematically abused that authority. He had sabotaged employees, coordinated with our competitors, and engaged in criminal conduct that harmed both individuals and the organization. He paused, letting the words settle. The easy response would have been to terminate that individual quietly and move forward as if nothing had happened. But I made a different choice. I chose to expose what had occurred, to investigate the systems that made it possible, and to commit publicly to changing those systems. That choice has had costs. Our stock price declined. Some business partners have questioned our stability. Media coverage has been intense and often critical. He looked directly at the employees gathered before him. But I want to tell you why I made that choice. I made it because I was confronted with the reality that one of our most talented employees, someone who had contributed enormously to this company's success, was physically harmed by someone in a position of power. And I realized that if I didn't act decisively, I would be communicating to every person in this room that your safety, your dignity, your worth as human beings is negotiable. That if harming you serves someone's ambition or protects the company's reputation, We would choose the ambition or the reputation over you. And I couldn't accept that. The auditorium was silent, hundreds of people holding their breath. So, we are implementing changes. Some of them will be uncomfortable. Decision-making will be slower, because it will require more oversight. Promotion processes will be more rigorous because we're implementing objective criteria. Reporting mechanisms will be more robust, which means some of you will face accountability you haven't faced before. And we are committing substantial resources to creating a corporate accountability division whose entire purpose is to prevent what happened from ever happening again. He gestured to Imani. That division will be led by someone who understands viscerally why these systems matter. Someone who experienced the failure of our previous structure. Someone I trust completely to build something better. Then he said the thing he had debated, including the personal acknowledgement that crossed the line from professional into something more vulnerable. I also want to acknowledge my own failure. I built this company with the intention of doing things differently, but I was willing to overlook ethical compromises as long as the numbers looked good. I valued results over process. I tolerated behavior that I should have confronted. And I failed to create the kind of environment where people felt safe reporting abuse. That failure is mine, and I am committed to learning from it. The response wasn't applause. It was too raw for that. But there was a shift in the room. A collective exhale that suggested something had been said that needed saying. After the speech, employees approached Imani with their own stories. Moments when they had experienced unfairness. Moments when they had witnessed harm and said nothing. Moments when they had compromised themselves to survive. Each story was a small piece of evidence that the crisis had been building for years, invisible to anyone who wasn't experiencing it directly. One woman, a senior developer, said, "I always thought if I just worked hard enough, if I was just good enough at my job, I could avoid the politics. But watching what happened to you made me realize that excellence isn't protection. The system has to change for any of us to be safe." The criminal investigation concluded with Jae Hyun Lim being charged with assault, corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. The charges carried potential prison time ranging from 3 to 7 years depending on conviction. But the more complex fallout was internal. The investigation had revealed that several other executives had been aware of at least some of his activities and had chosen not to report them. Min-hee Park, the HR director, had known about the falsified reports. The COO had been aware of irregularities in budget allocations. The head of communications had suspected the CFO was leaking information to journalists, but had rationalized it as strategic relationship building. None of them had committed crimes, but all of them had been complicit in creating the environment where crimes were possible. Seung-joon faced a decision. Did he terminate everyone who had been complicit, which would gut the leadership team but send a clear message? Or did he implement a more nuanced approach that accounted for degrees of responsibility? He discussed the question with Imani over coffee in his office on a Wednesday evening. The city below was transitioning to night, lights flickering on across the skyline. "I think," Imani said carefully, "that if you terminate everyone who was complicit, you're suggesting that there's no path back from failure. That once you've compromised yourself, you're irredeemable. And I don't think that's true. I think people can learn and change." "But accountability," Seung-joon countered. "If there are no consequences for complicity, what message does that send?" "There can be consequences that aren't termination," she replied. "Demotions, reduced bonuses, mandatory ethics training, public acknowledgement of failure, probationary periods. There are ways to hold people accountable while still giving them the opportunity to become better versions of themselves." He considered this, rotating his coffee cup between his hands. "Min-hee came to me yesterday and offered her resignation. She said she couldn't live with herself knowing that she had stayed silent while you were being targeted." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I would think about it," he said. "But I'm inclined to refuse the resignation and instead offer her a different role. Something that involves teaching ethics and compliance to new employees, using her failure as the foundation for helping others avoid making the same choices." "That seems right," Imani said. She'll be more effective as someone who acknowledges her complicity than as someone who just disappears. The conversation shifted then, becoming more personal. Seung-jun asked her how she was healing, not just physically, but emotionally. Whether she felt safe in the building now. Whether the changes being implemented felt adequate. "I feel safer," she said honestly. "But I also feel like I'm constantly aware of the machinery now. Before, I could just focus on my work. Now I'm always conscious of the power dynamics, the decision-making structures, who has authority, and how they're using it. It's exhausting. That awareness is valuable," he said, "but you shouldn't have to carry it alone." "I'm not alone," she replied. And the way she looked at him when she said it made the air in the office shift slightly, becoming charged with something neither of them had explicitly named yet. The bracelet appeared on Imani's desk on a Friday morning, wrapped in simple paper with no note. It was delicate silver with a small charm, a geometric design that looked vaguely like a building, though abstract enough to be open to interpretation. She recognized it immediately, though she hadn't seen it in years. Her grandmother had given it to her when she was 17, just before Imani left for university. "This represents home," her grandmother had said. "No matter how far you travel, no matter how much you achieve, remember that you carry home with you." Imani had lost the bracelet 2 years ago, or so she thought. It had disappeared from her apartment during a period of intense work stress, and she had assumed it had been misplaced during one of several moves. But here it was, on her desk, returned by some mechanism she didn't understand. She walked to Seung-jun's office without calling ahead. He was on a conference call but saw her through the glass wall and immediately ended the conversation, gesturing for her to enter. "How did you get this?" she asked, holding up the bracelet. He looked genuinely confused. "I didn't. I've never seen that before." She felt a chill run through her. If he hadn't returned it, who had? And how had they gotten into her apartment to retrieve it? The answer came from an unexpected source. Ji Soo-yoon knocked on the office door a moment later, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I should have asked permission. But I found it during the investigation. It was in a storage locker that the CFO had rented under a false name. There were several items there, things that had been taken from various employees. I think he collected them as trophies, maybe. Or leverage. I wasn't sure. But I recognized the bracelet because I had seen a photograph of you wearing it in one of your early employee files. So I took it and returned it to you. I should have explained, but I thought if I left a note it might raise more questions than it answered." Imani sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "He stole this from my apartment." "It appears so," Jisoo confirmed quietly. "Along with items from at least 4 other employees. Documents, personal items, photographs. I've returned everything I could identify. The rest I gave to the prosecutors as evidence." After Jisoo left, Imani looked at Seung-jun with something close to horror. "He was in my home. He went through my things. This wasn't just about sabotaging my work. He was violating every boundary." Seung-jun's expression had darkened with anger. "This adds breaking and entering to the criminal charges, and it suggests a level of obsession that's frankly terrifying. I need you to understand something," Imani said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt internally. "I was afraid of him before, but now I'm understanding that the fear was justified. He wasn't just a corporate rival. He was someone who saw destroying me as a personal project. I'm going to have security review your apartment," Seung-jun said immediately. "And I'm going to ensure you have access to whatever security measures you need. This is beyond acceptable." But what struck Imani most was the bracelet itself, the physical reminder that her grandmother's words about carrying home with her had been literal. Even when someone tried to take it, even when she thought it was lost, the essence of what it represented couldn't be stolen. She put it on her wrist, feeling the familiar weight of it, and made a decision. I'm not going to let his obsession define me. I'm not going to live in fear of what he might have done or could have done. I'm going to focus on building something better, and this bracelet is going to remind me every day why that matters. The announcement came on a Monday morning via company-wide email. All promotions and bonuses for the executive team were suspended indefinitely pending the completion of the corporate accountability review. The decision applied to everyone at director level and above, including Seung-jun himself. The response was immediate and polarized. Some executives understood the gesture as necessary accountability. Others saw it as collective punishment for one person's crimes. The tension manifested in the executive corridor, where conversations became clipped and carefully neutral, where people avoided making eye contact in elevators. Imani was in a meeting with the communications team when one of the senior directors confronted her directly. His name was Kwon-ho Lee, a man in his early 50s who had been with the company for 12 years and had built his reputation on delivering results regardless of obstacles. "This suspension is destroying morale," he said, his tone barely containing frustration. "People who have worked hard, who have delivered exceptional results, are being punished because of one person's criminal behavior. That's not justice. That's just spreading the damage wider." Imani met his gaze steadily. "The suspension isn't punishment. It's a pause while we assess whether the performance that earned those promotions was achieved through ethical means. If your work was genuinely exceptional and ethically sound, the promotion will proceed. But if your success came from exploiting the same systems that enabled the CFO's behavior, then yes, that needs to be reconsidered." "You're suggesting that everyone here is suspect," Kwon-ho said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm suggesting that we built a culture where certain behaviors were rewarded without sufficient scrutiny," Imani replied. "And before we continue rewarding those behaviors, we need to understand what they were." The meeting ended in tense silence, but the confrontation had clarified something important. The changes being implemented weren't just structural, they were personal. Every executive was being forced to examine not just their actions, but the assumptions underlying those actions. That evening, Seung-jun called Imani to his office. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was the weariness of someone carrying the weight of institutional transformation. "Kwon-ho filed a formal complaint about the promotion suspension," he said. "He's claiming it violates the terms of his employment contract. Legal thinks he might have a case." "What are you going to do?" Imani asked. "I'm going to stand by the decision," he replied, "even if it means litigation. Because if I back down now, it communicates that the reforms are negotiable. That if executives push back hard enough, I'll retreat to the old way of doing things. And I can't do that." He stood and walked to the window, a gesture Imani had noticed he made whenever he was processing difficult decisions. "I've been thinking about something my father once told me. He said that leadership is about making the decisions that everyone else is too afraid to make. At the time, I interpreted that as being willing to take financial risks, to make bold strategic moves. But I think what he actually meant was being willing to face the personal cost of doing the right thing. Even when it's expensive, even when it's unpopular." "Your father sounds wise," Imani said. "He was complicated," Seung-jun replied. "He built a successful business, but he also made compromises that I'm now trying to undo." Which makes this all feel like a conversation across generations. Me trying to honor what he built, while also acknowledging what was broken in the building. The open meeting was Imani's idea. A forum where employees at any level could ask questions directly to the executive team without filtering or preparation. It would be recorded and made available to all employees afterward. No question would be off limits. No answer could be corporate speak. The risk was substantial. Unscripted conversations could produce moments that would be embarrassing, revealing, or difficult to manage afterward. But Imani argued that transparency required vulnerability. And vulnerability required the willingness to be uncomfortable. The meeting took place in the main auditorium on a Wednesday afternoon. Approximately 600 employees attended in person, with another 2,000 watching via livestream from other offices and remote locations. Seung-jun opened with a brief statement. "We're here because trust has been broken, and the only way to rebuild trust is through honest conversation. So for the next 2 hours, you can ask anything. I won't promise you'll like all the answers, but I promise they'll be honest." The first questions were relatively soft, clarifications about the new accountability policies, timelines for the promotion review, questions about how the corporate structure was changing. But about 30 minutes in, someone asked the question that shifted the tone completely. "Mr. Kang." A woman from the engineering division stood up. "Why should we trust that you're actually committed to these changes and not just managing a PR crisis? What's to stop you from reverting to the old systems once the media attention fades?" Seung-jun was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, the entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. "The honest answer," he said finally, "is that you have no guarantee. You can't see into my mind or my future decisions. What you can see is my actions over time. You can see that I terminated a powerful executive even though it damaged our reputation. You can see that I suspended my own bonus along with everyone else's. You can see that I'm implementing oversight structures that will limit my own authority. Those are data points. But whether they represent genuine commitment or sophisticated PR management, that's something you'll have to assess over time based on consistency." He paused, then added, "But I'll tell you what changed for me personally. I saw someone I respect, someone whose work I value, harmed by a system I built. And I realized that my intention to create something better was meaningless if I wasn't willing to confront the reality of what I had actually created. That realization was painful. It required me to acknowledge my own failure. And that acknowledgement is what's driving these changes, not PR. Personal reckoning." Another employee asked, "How do you balance being competitive in the market while also implementing these ethical standards? Won't companies that don't have these constraints be able to move faster?" Imani answered this one. "In the short term, yes. Companies without ethical constraints can move faster because they're not spending time on oversight or accountability. But in the long term, those companies are building on unstable foundations. They're generating technical debt in human terms. Eventually, that debt comes due. Through lawsuits, through talent flight, through scandals that destroy value faster than unethical behavior created it. So our bet is that ethical operations are actually more sustainable and more competitive over meaningful timeframes." The questions continued for another 90 minutes, some challenging, some supportive, some simply curious about specific policy details. By the end, nobody had been destroyed, but everyone had been made slightly uncomfortable, which suggested the forum had achieved its purpose. The revelation came from an unexpected source. One of the external board members, a man named Daniel Chong, who had been serving on the board for 3 years, requested a private meeting with Seung-jun and Imani. Daniel was in his 60s, a Korean-American executive who had spent most of his career in Silicon Valley before returning to Seoul to serve on various corporate boards. He had a reputation for integrity, which made what he was about to reveal more significant. "I need to tell you something I should have disclosed when I joined this board," he began, his discomfort visible. "I was approached by Park Hae-kyung's representatives approximately 6 months ago. They offered me a consulting contract with one of their subsidiary companies. Lucrative, with minimal actual work required. The timing was obviously suspicious. It was clearly meant to influence my decisions on this board." "Did you accept?" Seung-jun asked. "No," Daniel replied. "But I didn't report the offer either. I simply ignored it and continued serving on the board as if nothing had happened. Which means I allowed Park's family to believe they might have leverage over me, which could have influenced how aggressively they approached other board members." He pulled out a folder containing email correspondence, the offer, his non-response, follow-up messages from Park's representatives. "I'm giving you this because I realize now that my silence was its own form of complicity. And I'm resigning from the board effective immediately, because I failed to meet the standard that you're trying to establish." Imani looked at this man who had built a 40-year career and was now voluntarily ending a prestigious position because he had failed to report an attempted bribe. "Your honesty matters," she said, "and I'm wondering if resignation is the right response. What if instead you stayed on the board and used this experience to help us build better protocols for how board members should handle these situations?" Daniel looked surprised. "You want me to stay after I just told you I was potentially compromised? You were approached. Seung-jun clarified. You didn't accept, and you're voluntarily disclosing it now, even though you could have stayed silent forever. That suggests exactly the kind of integrity we need on the board. What I would ask is that you agree to additional transparency measures, disclosure of all outside business relationships, regular ethics training, willingness to recuse yourself from decisions where there might be even perceived conflicts of interest. I can agree to that, Daniel said quietly. After he left, Imani turned to Seung-jun. That was the right decision. Punishing people for eventual honesty just creates incentives for permanent dishonesty. I'm learning, Seung-jun replied. Slowly, but I'm learning that accountability and redemption aren't opposing forces. They're complementary. The restructuring plan took final shape over 6 weeks of intensive work. Imani led the design process, but it involved input from dozens of employees at every level, a genuinely collaborative effort to reimagine how the company could operate. The final proposal included decentralized authority. Major decisions now required sign-off from at least 3 executives from different divisions, eliminating single points of control. Transparent promotion criteria. All advancement decisions would be based on documented performance metrics, reviewed by committees that included employees from the relevant division. Protected reporting channels. Employees could report concerns through multiple channels, including an external ombudsman who had no employment relationship with the company. Regular climate assessments. Quarterly surveys measuring workplace culture, with results published internally and discussed openly. Mandatory ethics training. All employees, including executives, would complete annual training on ethical decision-making, conflicts of interest, and reporting responsibilities. Reduced bonus weight. Individual performance bonuses would be capped at 15% of total compensation, reducing the incentive to pursue short-term results at ethical cost. The proposal was comprehensive, expensive, and genuinely transformative. It was also controversial. Several senior executives quit rather than operate under the new structure. Kwon-ho Lee, the director who had complained about the promotion suspension, submitted his resignation with a letter stating that the company had become hostile to achievement and success. 2 other vice presidents left for competitor companies, taking their teams with them. Each departure was painful, not just because of the loss of institutional knowledge, but because it represented someone choosing the old system over the new one. Seung-jun struggled with this more than Imani had anticipated. One evening, after the 3rd executive departure was announced, she found him in his office staring at the resignation letter. "I'm destroying the company," he said quietly. "I'm implementing these reforms, and the cost is that we're losing our best people. We're losing people who were successful under the old system," Imani corrected gently. "That's not the same as losing our best people. Some of them were talented, yes, but their talent was being expressed through structures that exploited others. The question isn't whether we're losing people. It's whether the people we're attracting now are better aligned with what we're trying to build." "And are they?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I know that the people who are staying, the ones who are choosing to be here despite the discomfort, they're choosing the company for different reasons now. Not because we're the easiest place to succeed, but because we're trying to be a place where success doesn't require compromising yourself." That night, they worked together on a company-wide communication addressing the departures. Seung-jun wanted to be defensive, to argue that the people leaving were wrong to do so. Imani pushed him toward something more nuanced. "We respect that not everyone will agree with the direction we're taking. Change of this magnitude requires profound shifts in how we work, and we understand that some people will choose environments that better match their priorities and working styles. We wish them well. For those who are staying, we promise that your choice will be honored through our continued commitment to building an organization where success and ethics aren't opposing forces." The media coverage evolved over time, shifting from sensationalism to something more substantive. Elena Rose, the journalist who had conducted the original interview with Seung-jun, published a follow-up piece that examined the structural changes Kyung Meridian was implementing and questioned whether other Korean companies would follow suit. The article included interviews with corporate governance experts, employees from various companies, and even some of the executives who had left Kyung Meridian. The executives who left were surprisingly candid. They acknowledged that the reforms were probably necessary, but they also expressed frustration that the implementation felt like collective punishment. "I worked hard for 15 years, one former vice president said in the article. "I delivered exceptional results, and then suddenly I'm being told that my success is suspect because of how I achieved it. That felt like betrayal." But Elena also interviewed employees who had stayed, including several who had experienced harassment or unfair treatment under the old system. "For the first time," one engineer said, "I feel like my work is being evaluated on its actual merit, rather than on whether I've successfully navigated office politics. That's worth the discomfort of the transition." The article concluded with an assessment that was both hopeful and uncertain. Kyung Meridian Group is attempting something rare in Korean corporate culture, a genuine reckoning with the systems that enable abuse. Whether this experiment succeeds or becomes a cautionary tale about the costs of idealism remains to be seen. But the fact that they're attempting it at all suggests that something is shifting in how we think about corporate power and responsibility. The article was shared widely, sparking conversations across social media and in business schools. Imani found herself being invited to speak at conferences about corporate ethics, workplace safety, and systemic change. She declined most of them, not because she didn't believe in the work, but because she was still actively building the systems she would eventually teach others about. One invitation she did accept came from a women's leadership conference in Seoul. The organizers wanted her to speak about navigating corporate environments as a woman of color, about resilience in the face of institutional barriers. She almost declined that one too, but Seong-jun encouraged her to accept. "Your story matters," he said, "not just as evidence of what went wrong, but as proof that systems can change." The speech was difficult to write. Imani didn't want to position herself as a victim, but she also didn't want to sugarcoat the reality of what had happened. She settled on framing her experience as a case study in how individual harm reveals systemic dysfunction. "I was assaulted," she said to the audience of approximately 800 women, "not because I was particularly vulnerable, but because I had become inconvenient to someone in power. And what I learned from that experience is that systems don't protect people automatically. They have to be designed to protect people. They have to be built with the explicit intention of distributing power, creating accountability, and making it difficult for any individual to abuse authority without consequence." After the speech, dozens of women approached her with their own stories. Moments when they had been harmed, when they had witnessed harm, when they had made themselves smaller to survive. Each story was a reminder that her experience wasn't unique, just uniquely visible. 3 months after the CFO's termination, the criminal trial began. Imani was scheduled to testify, which meant revisiting the assault in granular detail, having her credibility questioned by defense attorneys, being cross-examined about her motivations and her relationship with Seong-jun. The defense strategy became clear quickly. They were arguing that the assault had been an accident, that the evidence of corporate espionage was circumstantial, and that the entire prosecution was motivated by personal animosity rather than actual criminality. Imani's testimony took place on a Tuesday morning. She wore a navy suit, professional, authoritative, carefully chosen to project competence without seeming like she was performing competence. The courtroom was smaller than she had imagined, more bureaucratic than dramatic. The prosecutor walked her through the events of that night: the message, the corridor, the CFO's presence, the fall. She answered each question with precision, keeping her voice steady even when describing the moment her body hit the floor. Then came cross-examination. The defense attorney was a woman in her 50s, which Imani recognized as a strategic choice. Harder to accuse of sexism, potentially more effective at undermining another woman's credibility. "Ms. Rhodes," the attorney began, "you've had a very successful career at Kyung Meridian. Would you say Mr. Kang has been supportive of your advancement?" "Yes," Imani replied, seeing where this was going but unable to avoid it. "In fact, you've been promoted multiple times under his leadership, correct?" Yes. And it would be fair to say that you have a close working relationship with Mr. Kang? We work together closely, yes. Some might even say your relationship extends beyond purely professional? The prosecutor objected immediately, but the question had achieved its purpose, planting the suggestion that Imani's testimony was motivated by personal loyalty rather than factual accuracy. The cross-examination continued for 90 minutes. Questions about her memory of specific details, about whether she had provoked the CFO in any way, about whether her injuries were really as severe as claimed. By the end, Imani felt hollowed out, her experience reduced to a set of disputed facts. But then the prosecutor presented the security footage. The courtroom watched in silence as the video showed Jae-hyun's hand colliding with Imani, her body falling, his deliberate departure. There was something undeniable about the visual evidence. It removed the ambiguity that language could create. The judge's expression shifted as he watched the footage. When the video ended, he asked the defense attorney, "Does your client maintain that this was accidental?" The defense attorney hesitated, then said, "We maintain that the context of the interaction is more complex than a single video can capture." After Imani's testimony concluded, Seung-jun was waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom. He wasn't supposed to be there. Witnesses weren't allowed to observe each other's testimony, but he had come anyway. "How did it go?" he asked. "It felt like being assaulted again," Imani said honestly. "Different method. Same essential experience of having your reality questioned by someone with power." "I'm sorry," he said. "I wish I could have prevented this." "You couldn't have," she replied. "This is the cost of justice. The trial, the questions, the public examination. It's necessary, but that doesn't make it less painful." They stood there in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by the bureaucratic architecture of justice, and something unspoken passed between them. An acknowledgement that they had become bound together by this experience in ways that extended beyond corporate hierarchy or professional relationship. The secret garden was discovered by accident. Imani was working late on a Friday evening, reviewing implementation plans for the new accountability structures, when she noticed a door in the executive corridor that she had never paid attention to before. It was unmarked, easy to miss unless you were specifically looking for it. Curiosity prompted her to try the handle. It was unlocked. The door opened onto a narrow staircase that led upward. She climbed it, emerging onto the roof of the building. Not the main rooftop terrace that was used for company events, but a smaller space that had been converted into a garden. There were planters with herbs and small flowering plants, a bench, and a view of Seoul that was somehow more intimate than the panoramic views from the executive offices. Seung-jun was there, sitting on the bench with his jacket removed and his tie loosened. He looked up when she emerged, surprised, but not displeased. "I didn't know anyone else knew about this place," he said. "I didn't until 5 minutes ago," Imani replied. "Is this yours?" "My father built it," he explained. "When he was first starting his company, he would come up here to think. He said it helped him remember that the work we do isn't separate from the world. It exists within the world, affecting people, creating consequences beyond profit." Imani sat down on the bench beside him. From here, you could see the Han River, the neighborhood spreading out in all directions, the density of human life that the corporate towers sometimes made it easy to forget. "I've been thinking about something," Seung-jun said after a moment. "About power and what it's for. I always thought power was about the ability to make decisions, to direct resources, to shape outcomes. But I'm realizing that power is actually about the ability to protect, to create space for people to do work that matters without fear. And I failed at that. I had the power to protect you and every other employee, and I chose not to use it effectively. You're using it now," Imani said quietly. "Now," he agreed. "After you were hurt. Which means my timing was reactive rather than proactive. Which means I only changed after being confronted with undeniable evidence of harm. Most people don't change even then," Imani pointed out. "Most people would have contained the damage and continued operating the same way." "Maybe," he said. but I don't think I deserve credit for doing what should have been obvious." They sat in silence for a while, the city sounds drifting up to them. Distant traffic, the hum of activity that never quite stops in Seoul. "I need to tell you something," Seung-jun said, his voice carrying a different quality now, less corporate, more personal. "And I want you to understand that I'm not saying this because of our professional relationship or because I think it will affect anything about how we work together. But I need to say it, because if I don't, I think I'll regret it." Imani felt her pulse quicken, intuiting what was coming but not quite believing it. "What happened to you changed me," he continued. "Not just professionally, but personally. It made me confront the ways I had been complicit, the ways I had rationalized compromises. But it also made me realize that I care about you, not just as an employee, not just as a talented professional, but as a person whose well-being matters to me in ways that go beyond corporate responsibility." He turned to look at her directly. "I'm not asking you to respond to that. I'm not expecting anything. I just needed you to know that the work we're doing together, the restructuring, the reforms, it's not just about abstract principles for me. It's personal. Because you're important to me personally." Imani was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had said and her own response to it. "I need you to understand something too," she finally said. "I appreciate what you're saying, and I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed that our relationship has become more complex over the past few months. But I also need to be careful, because if we become personally involved, it changes every dynamic in the company. It potentially undermines the credibility of the work I'm doing, and it puts me in a position where my professional achievements could be attributed to our personal relationship rather than to my actual capabilities." "I know," he said, "which is why I'm not asking for anything right now. I just wanted you to know how I feel, so that it's named, rather than being this unspoken thing that affects our interactions without being acknowledged." "Thank you for that," Imani said. "And for what it's worth, I care about you too. I'm just not sure yet what that means, or whether it's something we can act on without compromising the work." They sat together on the bench as the evening deepened, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. Implementation timelines, upcoming board meetings, the logistics of the corporate transformation. But something had changed between them, made explicit rather than implicit. And both of them understood that the work ahead would now include navigating not just professional restructuring, but personal complexity. The trial concluded with a guilty verdict on all counts. Jae Hyun Lim was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with additional fines and permanent prohibition from serving as an executive in any publicly traded company. But the more significant outcome was what the trial revealed about systemic corruption. During testimony, prosecutors presented evidence that the CFO had been part of a larger network. Executives from multiple companies who had coordinated to manipulate markets, share confidential information, and undermine competitors through what amounted to organized corporate espionage. The revelation triggered investigations at 7 other major Korean companies. Within 6 months, 4 additional executives were criminally charged, and several companies faced regulatory sanctions. Kang Meridian, by virtue of having exposed the network, rather than being exposed by it, was positioned as a leader in corporate reform. The narrative shifted from company in crisis to company that chose transparency over damage control. But Imani knew that narratives were only useful if they translated into actual behavioral change. The real test would be whether the structural reforms held over time, whether the new systems became embedded in company culture, or gradually eroded back toward old patterns. 6 months after the verdict, she presented a progress report to the board. The data was mixed, but encouraging. Employee reporting. Complaints about unfair treatment had increased by 340%, which suggested that people now trusted the reporting systems enough to use them. Resolution time. The average time to investigate and resolve complaints had decreased from 43 days to 11 days. Turnover. Voluntary departures among high-performing employees had decreased by 18%, while departures among low-performing employees had increased by 22%, suggesting the company was successfully retaining talent while becoming less hospitable to those who couldn't meet ethical standards. Promotion equity. The diversity of employees receiving promotions had improved significantly. More women, more international employees, fewer promotions going to people with personal connections to executives. Financial performance. Revenue growth had slowed by approximately 8% compared to previous projections, but profitability had actually improved slightly due to reduced legal costs, lower turnover expenses, and more efficient operations. What this data suggests, Imani concluded, is that ethical operations aren't just morally preferable, they're also economically sustainable. We're becoming a stronger company by becoming a more accountable one. After the presentation, one of the external board members asked, "What's your biggest concern going forward?" "Complacency," Imani replied immediately. "The risk that we'll believe we've solved the problem and stop being vigilant. Systems only work if they're actively maintained. The moment we assume they'll run themselves, we create space for new forms of corruption to emerge." The final structural change was the creation of an independent oversight council, a group of external experts with no financial stake in the company who would have full access to internal operations and the authority to raise concerns directly with the board and the public. The council included a former prosecutor, a corporate ethics professor, a labor rights advocate, and a journalist who specialized in corporate governance. They were given offices within Kang Meridian headquarters, compensated well enough to ensure their independence, and granted legal protections that prevented the company from retaliating against them for critical findings. The first council meeting was public, live-streamed to all employees, and available for external viewing. It was a radical departure from typical corporate governance, transparency so complete it made many executives uncomfortable. Seung-joon opened the meeting with a statement. "This council exists to make us uncomfortable, to question our decisions, to ensure that the reforms we've implemented don't gradually decay back into old patterns. If you're ever entirely satisfied with our operations, we'll know you're not doing your job." The council members took their mandate seriously. Within the first 6 months, they issued 3 public reports identifying areas where the company's practices didn't yet meet its stated values. One report criticized slow implementation of diversity initiatives. Another questioned whether executives were being held to genuinely higher standards or just subjected to more sophisticated performance management. A third raised concerns about supply chain labor practices that hadn't been adequately reviewed. Each report was uncomfortable. Each one generated negative media coverage. And each one was exactly what the system was designed to produce: external pressure that prevented internal complacency. Imani worked closely with the council, using their findings to refine and strengthen the accountability structures. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the fact that she was simultaneously leading a division, testifying in related legal proceedings, and navigating her increasingly complicated personal feelings about Seung-joon. 8 months after the secret garden conversation, those personal feelings reached a crisis point. Imani was working late in her office when Seung-joon appeared in the doorway. "We need to talk," he said, and something in his tone suggested this wasn't about work. They went to the rooftop garden, their unofficial space for conversations that required privacy and honesty. The Seoul skyline glittered beneath them. Millions of lights representing millions of lives being lived in parallel to their own small drama. "I can't keep doing this," Seung-joon said without preamble. "Working with you every day, caring about you and pretending that our relationship is purely professional. It's dishonest, and it's making me ineffective as a leader because I'm constantly second-guessing whether my decisions about your work are influenced by my feelings about you as a person." "What are you suggesting?" Imani asked carefully. "I'm suggesting that we either acknowledge what's happening between us and figure out how to navigate it transparently, or we establish clear boundaries that prevent our personal feelings from affecting our professional relationship. But we can't continue in this ambiguous space." Imani had been anticipating this conversation for months, but now that it was happening, she felt the weight of how much was at stake. If we become personally involved, it changes everything. Every promotion I receive, every project I lead, people will question whether I earned it or whether it's because of our relationship. and that undermines everything we've built." "I know," Seung-jun said. "But the alternative is lying to ourselves and everyone else about the nature of our relationship, which is also corrosive." They stood there in the rooftop garden, facing each other across the space of what could and couldn't be said, and Imani made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. "Here's what I propose," she said. "We disclose our relationship publicly. We implement strict protocols around how you make decisions that affect me. We accept that some people will question my credibility, and we respond to those questions by ensuring my work speaks for itself. And we acknowledge that this is complicated and imperfect, but that complexity and imperfection are preferable to dishonesty." Seung-jun looked at her with something close to wonder. "You're willing to do that, knowing the cost?" "The cost of pretending is higher," Imani replied. "I learned that from watching how institutional dishonesty allowed harm to flourish. Personal dishonesty does the same thing. It creates space for corruption to grow." The disclosure happened on a Monday morning via company-wide email. Seung-jun and Imani jointly authored the message, which explained that they had developed a personal relationship over the course of working together on corporate reforms. They outlined the protocols they were implementing to ensure the relationship didn't create conflicts of interest. All decisions affecting Imani's compensation or advancement would be made by a committee that didn't include Seung-jun. Their personal relationship would be disclosed to the Oversight Council. They would recuse themselves from decisions where their relationship might create bias. The response was immediate and polarized. Some employees saw it as admirable transparency. Others saw it as confirmation of their suspicions that Imani's success had been based on personal connections rather than merit. The media coverage was intense. Some outlets portrayed it as a scandal, others as a bold experiment in corporate transparency. The most significant response came from an unexpected source. Several women within the company reached out to Imani to thank her for the disclosure. They explained that they had been watching how she navigated the corporate landscape, and that her willingness to address the relationship openly, rather than hiding it, had demonstrated a kind of integrity they hadn't expected. "I was worried you would hide it," one woman said during a conversation in the cafeteria, "because that would suggest that even people at the highest levels can't be honest about their personal lives. But you're being honest, and that makes me believe the other reforms might actually hold." But criticism came too. A prominent business journalist wrote a column questioning whether it was appropriate for a CEO and a senior executive to be personally involved, regardless of protocols. Several anonymous comments on social media suggested that Imani had seduced her way to success. The language was ugly, predictable, and painful despite being anticipated. Seung-jun struggled with the criticism more than Imani did. He had expected resistance, but he hadn't fully anticipated how gendered the attacks would be, how critics would focus on Imani's supposed manipulation while rarely questioning his judgment or ethics. "I'm making your life harder," he said one evening as they sat in his office reviewing the day's media coverage. "No," Imani corrected. "The system is making my life harder by being unable to imagine that a woman might be both professionally competent and personally involved with a male executive. Those are separate failures, and they're not your fault." "They're partially my fault," he insisted, "because by being involved with you, I'm exposing you to criticisms that you wouldn't face otherwise." "That's true," Imani agreed. "But the alternative would be hiding our relationship, which would eventually be exposed anyway, and would be much worse. At least this way, we're controlling the narrative by being honest about it from the beginning." Over the following months, the criticism gradually subsided as people grew accustomed to the disclosure, and as Imani's work continued to speak for itself. The Corporate Accountability Division expanded, implementing reforms that were being studied by other companies. The Oversight Council issued regular reports. The company's reputation shifted from troubled organization to leader in corporate ethics. But the personal cost was real. Imani found herself subjected to scrutiny that her male colleagues didn't face. Her wardrobe was analyzed for being too professional or not professional enough. Her tone in meetings was described as either too aggressive or too accommodating. Her successes were attributed to her relationship with Seung-jun, while her failures were attributed to her own incompetence. She bore it with the same resilience she had developed through years of navigating corporate spaces as a Black woman in Korea, but it accumulated into a kind of exhaustion that was difficult to name. The weariness of constantly being visible, constantly being questioned, constantly having to prove herself anew. 9 months after the disclosure, she gave a speech at an international conference on corporate governance. The speech was titled, "The Personal Cost of Institutional Change," and it addressed directly the reality that reforming systems required individuals to bear disproportionate personal burden. "When you challenge institutional patterns," she said to the audience, "you become the focal point for all of the system's resistance. People who are uncomfortable with change will direct that discomfort at you personally. You will be questioned, criticized, undermined, and the work of maintaining your integrity while facing that criticism is exhausting. But it's also necessary, because systems don't change through abstract policy adjustments. They change when individual people are willing to endure personal costs to create structural transformation." The wedding was small, just 40 guests in a private garden in Seoul, with minimal media presence and maximum personal significance. Imani wore a dress that she had designed with a Korean seamstress, combining elements of traditional Korean and West African aesthetics. Seung-joon wore a modern hanbok that his father had worn to his own wedding 40 years earlier. The ceremony blended traditions, readings in English, Korean, and Igbo, rituals from both families, acknowledgement that their union represented not just personal commitment, but cultural exchange, and the complicated work of building shared meaning across differences. Imani's grandmother attended via video call from the United States, her face projected on a screen that was positioned beside the altar. When Imani exchanged vows, her grandmother smiled with the expression of someone who had witnessed her granddaughter navigate impossible territories and emerge whole. The vows themselves were written collaboratively over several weeks. Imani promised to challenge you when comfort becomes complicity, and to support you when difficulty serves justice. Seung-joon promised to honor your autonomy, amplify your voice, and never use my position to diminish your authority. After the ceremony, the small gathering moved to a restaurant where the celebration continued with food that reflected both families' traditions. Korean dishes prepared by Seung-joon's family, Nigerian dishes prepared by Imani's cousins who had traveled for the wedding, and fusion creations that attempted to honor both. During dinner, Min-hee Park, the HR director, who had transformed from silent accomplice to active advocate, gave a toast that captured something important about what the wedding represented beyond personal commitment. "I have watched Mr. Kang and Ms. Rhodes, now Mrs. Kang Rhodes, I suppose, build something rare," she said. "Not just a company that operates ethically, though they have done that, but a relationship that refuses the usual compromises. They have chosen transparency over comfort, accountability over convenience, honesty over simplicity. And in doing so, they have demonstrated that personal integrity and professional responsibility are not separate domains. They're interconnected practices that require constant attention." The new surname, Kang Rhodes, had been debated extensively. Imani had initially considered keeping her own name entirely, then considered taking Seung-joon's, then finally proposed the hyphenated combination that honored both lineages. Seung-joon had agreed immediately, recognizing that the gesture represented the larger principle they were trying to embody. Power shared rather than consolidated, identity preserved rather than subsumed. After the wedding, they took a brief honeymoon in Jeju Island, 3 days away from Seoul, from the company, from the constant scrutiny. They hiked volcanic trails, sat in seaside cafes, talked about everything except work. It was a brief respite, necessary and insufficient, before returning to the complex reality of being both life partners and professional collaborators. To closing, the architecture of redemption. 2 years after the assault in the maintenance corridor, Kang Meridian Group published its annual Corporate Accountability Report. The document was 180 pages of detailed analysis, transparent about both successes and ongoing challenges. The successes were significant, Employee satisfaction had increased by 34%. Voluntary turnover among high-performing employees had decreased by 41%. The gender pay gap had narrowed by 18%. And the company had successfully recruited talent from competitors specifically because of its reputation for ethical operations. But the challenges were honest too. Implementation of supply chain labor standards was behind schedule. Diversity in senior leadership remained below targets. Some divisions were still struggling to internalize the culture changes. And there had been 3 incidents of harassment that had been handled through the new reporting systems, but indicated that problematic behavior hadn't been entirely eliminated. The report concluded with a section titled, "The Ongoing Work," written jointly by Seongjun and Imani. We began this transformation because a moment of violence revealed systemic dysfunction. But we have learned that transformation is not a project with an end date. It's a practice that requires constant attention. We will never be done creating accountability. We will never finish building ethical systems. What we can do is commit to the work, remain transparent about our failures, and continue learning from the people most affected by our decisions. On the evening the report was published, Seongjun and Imani sat in the rooftop garden where so many important conversations had taken place. The Seoul skyline spread beneath them, constant and changing. Millions of lives being lived in buildings that looked solid, but were always in flux. "Do you think it was worth it?" Seongjun asked. All of the difficulty, the criticism, the personal cost. Imani thought about the question seriously. She thought about the maintenance corridor, the bruises, the trial. She thought about the engineers who now reported harassment without fear, the women who advanced based on merit, the systems that distributed power instead of concentrating it. "Yes," she said. Not because it solved everything, it didn't, but because it demonstrated that systems can change, that institutions can be transformed if people are willing to endure the discomfort of transformation. And that's worth documenting, worth protecting, worth building on. He reached for her hand, the gesture simple but significant. 2 people who had learned that vulnerability and strength weren't opposing forces but complementary practices. "I used to think," Seongjun said, "that leadership meant having answers, being decisive, projecting confidence, making bold moves. But I've learned that actually it means asking better questions, listening to uncomfortable truths, building systems that acknowledge your own limitations. That's not what they teach in business school," Imani observed. "No," he agreed, "but maybe it should be." Below them, the city continued its endless motion, people going home from work, beginning their evening shifts, meeting friends, navigating relationships, making compromises and refusing them, building lives within systems that were sometimes responsive and sometimes resistant to their needs. And in the building beneath them, the systems they had built continued operating. Reports being filed, investigations being conducted, promotions being evaluated, accountability being maintained not perfectly, but persistently. The bracelet on Imani's wrist, the one that had been stolen and returned, caught the light. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "No matter how far you travel, no matter how much you achieve, remember that you carry home with you." She had traveled far. She had achieved much. But she had also learned that home wasn't a place you carried. It was something you built, deliberately and collectively, by making choices that honored both who you were and who you wanted to become. "What happens now?" Seongjun asked, though she suspected he wasn't really asking about the company. "Now," Imani said, "we keep building, not because the work is easy or because we're certain of success, but because the alternative is accepting systems that harm people. And we've both decided we can't do that." They sat together as the evening deepened. 2 people who had learned that redemption wasn't a destination, but a direction. The constant work of recognizing failure, acknowledging harm, and choosing to build something better despite the cost. The bruises had healed. The systems had been restructured. The company had been transformed. But the work was never finished. And perhaps that was the real lesson. That justice wasn't something you achieved once and preserved through inertia, but something you practiced daily, imperfectly, with the understanding that today's success didn't guarantee tomorrow's integrity. In the maintenance corridor where the assault had occurred, the company had installed a memorial plaque. Not a dramatic gesture, but a quiet acknowledgement. Here, harm was done. Here, silence was broken. Here, we learned that accountability requires more than intention. It requires action, sustained over time. And throughout the building, in conference rooms and hallways, on rooftop gardens and in cafeterias, people continued the difficult, necessary work of building an institution that honored both achievement and ethics, both ambition and care. Not every wound is physical. Not all power is invulnerable. And when silence weighs more than success, it is time to change the rules. The story didn't end in triumph. It ended in commitment. The daily choice to build systems that protected rather than exploited, to use power to create space for others' flourishing, to remain uncomfortable rather than accept harmful comfort. That was the architecture of redemption. Not a single transformative moment, but thousands of small decisions, accumulated over time, building structures that would outlast any individual's tenure and continue the work long after the founders had moved on. Seungjun and Imani stood to leave the rooftop garden, returning to the work that would continue tomorrow and the day after, and the years beyond. The city lights sparkled beneath them, each one a life being lived, a choice being made, a system being either perpetuated or challenged. They walked down the stairs together, hand in hand, carrying the knowledge that they had built something worth protecting, and the understanding that protecting it would require everything they had learned and everything they had yet to learn. The door closed behind them. The garden remained, silent and patient, waiting for the next conversation that would require honesty in the space where honesty was possible. And in the building below, the work